You're listening today to the Oxygen Thieves. I'm your host, Gary, and we have Mike, Paul, and Nick with us today. Paul, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Hey guys, my name is Paul. I'm a former local police officer. Today during the podcast, I'm going to be drinking a little bourbon. I'm not a big bourbon guy, but I'm going to be having some Four Roses single barrel bourbon today. Definitely check that one out. I'm usually an Irish whiskey guy, but we're going bourbon tonight. So let's talk, sit around, have a couple drinks.
Yeah, my name's Nick. Missed last week, unfortunately, but glad I could be here this week. A little bit about me. I currently am a police officer. I'm a sergeant. I've been in the field for about 8 years. Worked in a city, also worked in a rural town. Now I'm at a hospital, so I've done a little bit of everything. And today I've had Carlsberg Pilsner. It's Danish. And right now I have a Guinness draft.
All right. I'm Mike, prior service, active Army, and a little bit of National Guard, Army as a combat medic. And I have with me, I've got some nice unfiltered sake tonight. So cheeky buy, not bottom shelf this time.
I'm Gary. I'm prior service, active duty infantry. I was deployed to Afghanistan and came back to do all this gig. Let's move into some stuff we were talking about last time. We had a discussion in regards to how a police officer's initial training isn't necessarily like special forces, whereas there's a lot of comparison to that out there. It's more like the introductory training that you might get in the military. And I wanted to share a story or a little explanation of how my back history went in my very initial training for that basic and AIT training. Essentially, everything happened quite quickly for me. I signed up my last year of high school, and I went directly into MEPS, which is basically where you decide the final job that you're qualified for and sign all the papers. Once I actually shipped to go to basic training, I went to what was called an in-processing unit. And you stay there anywhere between a week or 2 weeks, depending on what you're doing or when you show up. And you're basically there to get everything finished to get started for your basic. And that would include things like shots, your equipment issued, and then you have to wait once you finish all that stuff till the next basic starts for your particular job. And the reason that is because you do basic in the Army at different locations based on your job. So I went to Benning. A lot of the combat MOS was out there at that period of time. So I was doing basic very closely to the medics and all those guys as well. Essentially, my when I got to the in processing unit, funnily enough, my plane got delayed and I showed up in the middle of the night instead of during the day. Because of that, I showed up at like, I think it was 1 o'clock, 1 or 2 in the morning, got on the bus, got there, and they didn't have anything open because everybody was went home for the day. And so I slept on the sidewalk. So that was fun. That was my first day in the, just
And
getting into
little
it.
did you know that was the first of many nights.
Indeed. Yeah. Sleeping on the sidewalk, grass, dirt, etc. There's even a story about sleeping in the graveyard one time. Um, maybe we'll talk about that at some point. So I got all my stuff done in processing, which is pretty not interesting. So you're not really doing any training, like I said before, shots, gear issued, and maybe a little bit of like climate acclimatation. So since you're there for a week or two, you can get used to the new climate. And Benning is a lot different than a
Tell
lot of
them where it's
places around the
at.
United States. So that's in Georgia, right by the right near Columbus, Georgia. My first experience going to my basic training was a little bit different than other people's. A lot of people will ship off, because the bases are relatively large. Mine, the unit I went to, was actually walking distance. It was basically a giant hill, and then you would end out at my basic training. So they made you carry your stuff instead of getting on a bus.
How
So
much
I had to
stuff
carry
did
my
you
stuff
have?
up there. It was just a single duffel bag at the time. Little did I know that was going to multiply relatively quickly, but it was only a single duffel bag.
Did you still have all the stuff that you brought?
I did, but it was only a single duffel bag, like I said. So the amount of equipment and then my few personal items that I was able to bring, all stacked in that one duffel bag. There was nothing else. But once we got there, they did the typical hazing thing where you're already super I was never super in shape going into it. I think I actually worked out with Nick prior to going in quite a bit.
Yes, sir.
Anyway, so we didn't do tons of running prior, and so I wasn't used to running, so especially not with equipment, and I was super tired at that point. But we got there, and they made you hold it over your head. You're already exhausted, and then they essentially what happened was is you hold it up until you can't hold it up anymore, and the last person to drop it was the person had to run, like, it was like 5 miles or something like that around they had a little track. There was a quarter-mile track nearby, and so they just made them run in circles a whole bunch, but while we like did the initial processing. In addition to that, the basic really wasn't a lot of training in terms of what you would normally expect a training on the job would be. Basic was a lot of get your ducks in the row, get learn how to be in the military, and if you're undisciplined, how to be disciplined in various ways. So being able to listen to your supervisors and stand in line correctly and walk and march and stuff like that. Just real simple stuff. And I think why my basic side focuses that is because my AIT training was all in one.
What do you
And
mean
so
AIT?
AIT was advanced individual training, or essentially your job training, what you're going to do. If you're an infantryman, you would train specifically for that. Or if you're a mechanic, that's when you would go to train as a mechanic.
So AIT means like your job.
Right. And I think almost, correct me if I'm wrong, that AIT, you kind of start to specialize in things, and makes me feel like that's how in the police world where you'd start getting into the specializations out in the field police world as well, start to focus on things. But once I got to basic, we didn't do a lot, like I said, in terms of training. It wasn't until much later that we actually started learning much more complex concepts, and that was due to the fact that my AIT and basic were mashed together. They were all one training experience. There were a lot of the standard is you go to basic.
Well, how long was
Mine
that?
was 14 weeks from start to finish, and I know some other, pretty much almost every other job, even the infantry, would split it up, and it's just I happened to fit into a program at the time that was all in one.
Okay.
Yeah, and once we did get into the infantry training, that's when things escalated and you actually started learning how to do your job. So we were weeks in before we learned, how to clear rooms like an infantryman would do that. So going through hostile, houses essentially, or how to, do squad maneuvers and larger maneuvers with each other and things like that. To piggyback on that, it was a lot of iteration on that. It only gets you so far, especially that 14-week course that I took. And I would say that it was pretty wholly inaccurate in terms of the grand picture of how you do a job, because there was a lot of things that were included in there that were archaic for the time period in what we were doing. So I was going through in '06, essentially, and we were at war in the desert at that time. Desert tactics and things like that were something that you'd want to train for and make people understand. Whereas in those introductory 14 weeks, we didn't cover anything that was relevant in terms of desert tactics. We trained for World War II stuff. So we learned trench fighting as well. They didn't teach you how to fight guerrilla fighters. They didn't teach you how to fight guerrilla fighters. They didn't teach you how to fight in a desert. They taught you how to fight in the woods a little bit, and how to fight in a trench a little bit. And then it was additional team building exercises outside of that. So that would including things like simulation training, trying to get you into scenarios. Basically, a giant projector screen, and you had pneumatic fake guns, and you would shoot or not shoot essentially. And there wasn't a lot to it at the time, basically running scenarios so you can shoot when you need to or not shoot, things like that, trying to get you used to it. Or doing battle out like a battle program where there's just tons of enemies coming in and you're just trying to like engage as a squad. I don't know how much that helped us in the long run, but we did that. Then we did some live fire exercises. We did shoot a lot of rounds, but we did more range shooting than anything in terms of live fire and initial training. We didn't do hardly anything with live fire with a big team or anything like that.
Did you do anything other than just shoot guns?
Surprisingly, not really.
Did you do any woodcraft stuff, like navigating in the woods?
So it was everything was that we did was related to shooting guns. So the objective for an infantryman is to engage the enemy and destroy it. Anything that's related to that, directly related to that. So that would include how to get to your enemy, which would be land navigation. We had in basic, you had to pass like a very fundamental navigation course. But it was pretty easy from the stuff that I did much later on. And it was more getting you acclimated to actually using a map and trying to really use a compass and some basic tools and working at night and
So
things
you
like
had
that.
rudimentary like woodcraft stuff. So that was
Right.
so you did a lot
Right.
more of that later, but at basic training it's just you because when I did basic it was very trivial, but we did have just a little bit. So it was the same for you.
Yeah. And we did it more so after we are kind of transitioning out of basic. And I think that was trying to relate us, this is more of a job that you do in the infantry or something like that. But we never got into details with it. Some of the stuff that like everything was designed around moving and engaging the enemy. So like land navigation was additional things that we did. We did a lot of physical fitness things. That was anywhere from just basic push-ups and sit-ups all the way out to obstacle courses or ruck marches where you're carrying equipment. And there's all kinds of crazy stories with that going through. But in terms of that relating to police, did you guys do anything like ruck marches or scenario training? How'd that go for you guys in the police world?
Nick, want to answer that first? I've got a few things I can add in after.
Yeah, sure. Um, so the police academy, in all honesty, I'm based in Ohio, so I guess I'll preface it with that because every state is different to some degree. They have different standards. Um, you can put yourself through the academy in Ohio. Some places, when they hire you, will send you to the state academy, which is kind of that's the hardest one. You're going to get the most paramilitary type of experience. Wake you up early, make you run far, yell at you, make you swim, all that stupid stuff. Most people do not go through that academy. Um, I put myself through the academy, and basically PT and stuff like that, that was up to me. So they told us when we started, 50% of you will fail the state PT exam, and exactly 8 out of 16 people failed at the end of 16 months. And they didn't pass on their redo either. They literally failed out and had to redo the whole thing. So it was completely up to you to run on your own time, to make weight, do all that stuff.
So that's a similar but not entirely the same as when I went through my basic in AIT, because ultimately at the end of the 14 weeks you had to pass a PT test and you had to do a week long excursion out in the woods to like practice various maneuvers and things like that, non-live fire stuff, more like blanks, shooting with blanks and like practicing everything you've learned like bushcraft and things like that. um, and then you had to do a giant ruck march. At the time for us was like I think it ended up being 5 or 8 miles. Wasn't super crazy or anything, but for the time it was pretty crazy because we
I
didn't do.
believe that you're not remembering it very well because the ruck march at the end of basic training, the 9-week basic training was 25 miles.
That's not the case. Outside of we didn't do outside of basic training rucksack march, so we did an infantry uh, rucksack march at
I
the end
could
of that.
say in my own experience comparing it to Nick's, I had more of the first one that he described, where you're getting up early at 4 o'clock in the morning, running, getting yelled at. That was my academy. Where I was at, it was a one single academy for the whole state, and I believe we talked about that last time. And you had to already have a job hired on to actually go to the academy. And so for us, we didn't do any ruck marches or anything like that, but we PT'd every morning, and it generally got progressively harder as the course went on, or as the classes went on throughout the weeks. You have a lot of people that come in there out of shape, so they're kind of work you up, and it gets harder and more difficult as time goes on. But you mentioned one other thing, Gary, in regards to scenario training. We actually did a lot of that where I went to the academy. We had scenario houses where you would literally respond to calls. You'd have instructors who would be the subjects that you're responding to. We actually had simulated traffic stops. So you'd have instructors who were driving the car that you were pulling over, for instance. And so we did a lot of that simulated activity in the academy that I went to.
That's interesting. I guess that makes a lot of sense for a police officer to try to an instructor to convey real world scenarios in that sense. Whereas I don't think there was any focus on that, like super real world scenarios in our infantry training, other than the introductory to the squad tactics and the introductory to like house clearing and things like that, trying to get you in like into it. But they never like it was never the hyper focus. And in that period of time, like everybody's trying to like get up to speed on what it really is to be infantry. So like the during that time that we're not doing these hyper focus things, we're doing things like learning what the weapons are that we were using, learning how to tear them apart, learning how to clean the rifles, and like some of the fundamental tasks that once you're in an infantry unit, that is like the baseline. If you don't know how to do that,
Yeah, I
you're in
mean,
trouble, kind of stuff.
granted, I never served in the military, but I'm looking at it and I believe we touched a little bit on this last time, and I may be wrong about that, but I look at it from the perspective of, as a soldier, especially at that young level of just getting out of your advanced training, going to your unit, you're just going to be doing what you're told to do. Like you're not like making a whole lot of decisions as a boot coming out, right? So it's like literally just, hey, who's the guy that I'm supposed to follow, and that's where I'm going.
Right. And that's a big difference to where a police officer may, as a new police officer, you very quickly may be making decisions on your own, whereas a base level infantryman won't be making very complex or engaging things in very complex manner
Right.
without some kind of assistance. Whether that's another team member, team leader, or squad leader. There's tons of people around you to help you along the way if you're
Yeah,
really
and
messed up.
law enforcement is certainly like that to a larger extent, especially you field training, that kind of stuff. But that first day you get released, especially for these agencies where you aren't always paired up with a partner, which I would say a majority of the agencies in the country probably are that way, as opposed to somewhere like New York or Chicago, where they generally ride around with a partner. But if you get your car, it's your car, you're rolling solo, man, and it's like that first day you're out there on your own, you could be fighting for your life, and making those split-second decisions.
Nick, when you were out and about, did you run largely on your own when you're out in the cruiser,
Yeah,
or?
so it varies wildly in the state. It depends on where you work. So small towns, I actually worked with a lot of guys who start out that way. You may spend a day with the chief, who may be the only paid officer in that town. And it's like, here's the cruiser, here's the keys, go do something. And you're like, you're scared to death to do anything, because you're like, I have no clue what I'm doing, and that's kind of how a lot of those towns are, in a scary way. And some guys never leave towns like that. They literally teach themselves or learn from, just other officers telling them things from afar. They may stop something and not know what they have and call somebody and figure out what to do. But when I went to the city, it was drastically different. I spent 16 weeks in field training with another officer, and then you go through a scenario day where it's literally all day, kind of doing some of the stuff Paul was talking about. We did do that in the academy as well, but they want to see how you perform. And it's a round table of like the chief administrators, sergeants, pretty much everybody, and they say whether or not you're good to go, and they cut you loose. And there are people that don't make it. There were several people that didn't make it when I went through. Luckily, I was not one of them. I was on my own right away. But
What kind of standardization is there for it?
it's a department to department basis. There is no standard. There's nothing set forth by the state of Ohio that says, well, here you need to at least do, this kind of scenario or that kind of scenario, or, look at this. There's none of that once you leave the academy.
Yeah,
Well,
there
what's it?
is a. Let me interrupt you here, Mike. The only like true standardization that I'm aware of is the CALIA accreditation.
And what is that?
That is the I believe it's the commission commission. I'd have to look it up. It's the basically a nationwide a group that you have to show that your department meets a certain standard to get CALIA accreditation. The
Is that a national organization or okay?
Yeah, it's the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. And so basically the way that would work, and when I was working in law enforcement, our agency was in the process of going through CALIA accreditation. It's really expensive to do that. And so what you're doing is you're taking your policies, if you have any, which you do have to have some type of SOP or standard operating procedures, some type of general orders manual. And so you take your SOP or your general orders manual and look at what the CALIA standards are, and then you have to pretty much rewrite your standards to meet what they say you have to meet. And so when you go in, and you look and you see you have this general order or this particular standard operating procedure for whatever you can imagine. This is what you're supposed to do. You know, they're the ones that can give you a sticker to put on your car, and you'll see those if you guys ever look for them. There's like a little sticker. It's like usually a white and blue gold sticker. But agencies can spend years going through this accreditation process, and so they're trying to use that as a standardization throughout the country. But the reality of that is that it's so extraordinarily expensive. Agencies will have a group who is within the department who is solely dedicated to writing the manual to make sure that they meet those standards. And the agency that I work for, we got the CLIA accreditation after working on it for several years, but then we didn't get reaccredited because it was too difficult. So they didn't want to put the effort into maintaining the accreditation because it's actually harder to maintain it than it was to originally get it. But I would say that if you're looking for some type of standardization among training and procedures within law enforcement agencies, that's probably the only place to look within the country, I would say.
That's the only thing that has even started that's nationwide kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's I mean,
Okay.
it's designed to create a standardization among training, among the procedures. How do you operate your agency? What are your specific general orders? And so, you could maybe look at a CLIA accredited agency in Oregon versus one that's in Alabama, and if you both have CLIA accreditation, your procedures should pretty much be the same.
They will all have the same overlapping standards, maybe with a few things outlined, but they will all meet the same template.
Yeah,
with maybe
and
a
I mean,
few
it goes
extra.
through a plethora of different things. I mean, it talks about use of force, use of deadly force, reporting of your use of force. So, a lot of what that CLIA accreditation was documentation. So, like, trying to create more documentable procedures to show that you are complying with what the standards actually are. Does that make sense?
Yes, how to properly annotate all of your everything.
Yeah. And to show, okay, we're doing what CALIA says we're supposed to do, and here's the documents that show that we're doing it. So document. And that, honestly, that became extremely tiring because a lot of times you were basically triplicating your paperwork just to meet those accreditation standards. Or you'd have an accreditation manager that would come into your shift brief and say, hey, I need to see, X, Y, and Z on your reports today. So spend an extra hour making sure that you implement this particular process that you did. Maybe you made an arrest, and I want you to make sure that you said these exact words within your paperwork, just so I can document that this is how we do it, so that I can use this as proof that we're doing it the way that you say you're going to do it.
And were you doing anything like that, Nick?
I imagine if anybody would have had it, would have been the city. I don't know personally if they did have that. I know for sure that we do not at the hospital, and also I was going to say, if that is the only federal training standard, let's say, and kind of what Paul is describing is the process to maintain that, to set that up, and how difficult that is. Imagine these smaller towns where, like the place I started, where the chief is the only paid officer. I actually worked for free when I started. That used to be the experience is your payment. No, with 2 or 3 guys, you are not getting an accreditation like that. Nobody has time for that. Nobody has the money for that.
Absolutely not. You would need probably 4 guys just to be working on something like that full time to make that happen, to get accreditation. So yeah, some small podunk town is definitely not going to have that. And I think that's evident in what you said in regards to the training and experience that someone's going to get in those agencies versus somewhere that is a larger agency that has much more in-depth training.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of touches what we were talking about last time, Gary, in regards to how different training actually is in the United States for law enforcement. That there's not a lot of standardization among the training from state to state or agency to agency. Like, you're getting similar stuff a lot of the times, but there's no overall umbrella where it's like, okay, this is police training in the United States. That just doesn't exist.
That's a big difference because, in the Army, you got a federal training program. There's no, when you're first getting in, that's it. There's nothing extra about it. So everybody goes through something that's very similar. That's iterative as they change it over time. But it's not like police training where, not only do standards vary by state, but they vary by, if you're in a city, are you at the sheriff, or where are you even at? You may be in a small town.
They also vary. Like in Ohio, for example, I could have gone to the state academy. Let's say they put me through that where I live. And then let's say I move to Columbus or Cleveland or a bigger city. They have their own academy, and they don't care whether you went to school or not. So they may send you all the way back through initial training to do things exactly how they want you to do them. So it varies wildly.
So Columbus has their own training event in Ohio, right? The capital city don't they?
In other words,
kind of
each district
okay
has their own standards.
Yep. If you go to school somewhere else and you've been doing it for 5 or 6 years, if I've been doing it for 8, right now, if I would go to Columbus, they're going to send me all the way back through their own school.
Okay.
That's crazy.
So to sum it all up, there is no universal standards, and everything is individualized for each independent area.
Yeah, it's really wild if you think about it.
Okay.
And I'm just talking about a state, like Paul was saying. You start talking about other states, like even agencies. Our highway patrol doesn't do the same thing that Michigan's highway patrol does. The jurisdictions are different. Like, so many things vary. There is no standards.
Sure. And I think there may have been a quote standard list to pass the training, and on my side as an infantryman, but that included those 3 things I talked about, which was the PT test, the you had to do the week long event, and then you had to do the ruck march back, and then it was like, hey, you passed, now you get to go on to whatever else you're doing, based on your contract.
What I can see, Gary, though, is you, as an infantryman, you have the standard for only one singular job for one singular person, which
Sure.
is actually a more simplistic job. You're actually a lower tier job.
Well, let me interject here. I think you're going down a path that I wasn't headed. So we had those 3 things that the main things that we had to pass. But a lot of times people would not pass those, and they would get pushed on, especially in the time era. I was, like I said, a '06, '07 era. So if you didn't pass your PT test, if you were okay at stuff, they would fib your PT test on the documentation
yeah.
and ship you to a unit. And the same thing with everything else. Unless you're really, truly terrible, then they would recycle you back to the beginning and make you do stuff again. But that's just the time era, really, because you're talking about Afghanistan and Iraq at that period of time.
That was during the surge.
Sure, but anyway, they largely depended on the units. Again, you had that standard training, and then they largely depended on the units to finalize that training before you're actually committed to war. But in my case, I didn't immediately go to war. I stood up a new unit. So I trained for a few years before I went. But when we actually deployed, we got people fresh out of basic. They had 30 days of extra training. So they may have failed at things in that initial training, had came to our unit for 30 days and then shipped out to ship with us, with the guys who've been training with each other for a few years. And that was a big change in perception. It's and skill levels there are massively different, even though, in the grand scheme, you're like, oh, got a police officer in the same regard. Whereas you have a new officer, really depends on where you actually became that officer, if you got trained, how much training you got afterwards out of that initial certification. Nick, did you have any experience with people being set loose at all without state certification?
Yeah, that's not really a thing in Ohio. So I remember Paul talking about it last week and kind of touched on it a little bit tonight about how you could start working for an agency technically prior to going to school. You can do that, but you can't do anything. So if you ride along with somebody and you're waiting to go to the academy, you've technically been hired, let's say, you are not to even get out of the car. You stay in the car, unless it's like life or death. Maybe you can grab the shotgun and back somebody up. You know what I
So
mean?
you're effectively just a ride along.
You're riding along, you're watching, you're going to
Yeah.
go clean the stairs back at the station, maybe sweep the garage. You're doing like that, welcome, but you're not doing anything as far as getting out and handling anything, talking to anybody, nothing like that. It's not allowed in the state of Ohio. You can actually, if they find out you're working without a commission in Ohio or you haven't gone to school, you actually can just essentially be banned in a way. You're
You
not going to
get
be able to.
blackballed.
You can't operate as a peace officer ever again in this state.
That's interesting that it goes into this thing that we talked about over and over here, is how varied that training is. And Ohio is one thing, whereas another state may let you go out without that training, whereas other states may force you to go through at least some fundamental training for
Yeah.
they.
And you can still find guys in Ohio that have been around long enough to where that was a thing. Guys that came in like the 60s, 70s, people's grandpas who worked, maybe some people are still hanging around as deputies or something like that. It was literally show up, here's a belt, here's a gun, like a revolver, and yeehaw. There was no school. But once they started to implement that, you could be grandfathered in essentially, if you kind of came in pre that era, but it's not a thing anymore.
Yeah, I know a guy from back in the day. He said that when he became a cop, all you had to do was be good with a gun. But yeah, that was a long time ago.
Yeah, it's definitely not like that anymore. Gary, I've got a quick question for you in regards to your training. In your infantry training or as a soldier, I assume you did building entry and detaining subjects and things like that. Uh, is that something that you had experience in? Because again, I'm assuming you did that, clearing a building or something of that nature as an infantryman. Did you have any type of actual training in that environment as far as how to detain and search subjects?
So, in the infantry training, they taught us how to do clearing houses, but in terms of, and like some very basic search stuff. But what the stuff that we're talking about searching for isn't people. We're looking for explosives, we're looking for weapons, we're looking for drugs, things like that were in the environment. So we did a little bit of cursory training on that, but that was very minutely touched on in the initial training. Once we got to the unit, that's when we got into depth on how to truly search people, how to even allow people to get into the circuit. How does somebody even get into the scenario where they get searched in a wartime environment? How does that would largely be civilians, but in the same token, you can search combatants at the
Yeah, so
same token.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm thinking about like a scenario in my head. Like you kick a door down, you're going in, you're clearing a house. There's subjects in there. You're going to detain them, or are you just going to move past them? Like what's your process there?
So detainment training didn't take place um, until the unit, so they didn't teach you how to deal with people until then. But in my experience, we did learn, and a lot of times, if we were to kick a door in a real war environment, essentially you're clearing the house of combatants. Or you have an specific objective. There's really only two reasons why you kick doors down. It's somebody shooting you out of it, or you have a specific objective you're
Okay, so you
accomplishing
wouldn't
in
like
that
go in
place.
there. There's no combatants, but maybe there's 3 people that you're looking at. You're not going to put them in flex cuffs or anything like that and search their person for weapons or anything of that nature.
Well, you got to think about the people who kind of attire that these people are wearing. A lot of
Right.
times it's just like these robes. And so it's really easy to check for weapons. Almost nobody hides weapons over there other
Okay.
than explosives. That's really the only thing you find. Um, And in the case of if you're in a house with a guy with explosives on him, then you're not gonna save yourself unless you've already shot him, essentially. So there's not the searching for weapons really wasn't a huge thing on the people, because if there was a combatant, they didn't hide weapons. It's not like in policing where you have people who
Right.
hide their weapons for a while and then bring them out. It's if they have their weapons, they're engaging you before you show up, because they know when you kick the door down, they are 100% outmatched at that kind of range.
When you're entering in this concept, this is soldiers coming in, not police or SWAT. So this is coming in with violence of action. And we're coming in because it's war. We're not coming in because of a police action or to suppress the situation. We're coming in because it's a war action.
Sure, but I would look at a lot of what the military did maybe over the years in Iraq or Afghanistan became a police function, police actions.
Yes.
You're correct there. So that's where I was leading in here, is that there's really only two reasons why you would go in there. You don't just go into somebody's house because
Right.
you don't get calls. So you're only going in there for you're either actively being shot at from that, or you think you are being engaged from that, or you
I
have
gotcha.
intel
Right.
on that building for some reason. You don't typically go into buildings for any other reasons in terms of literally clearing them like that. But we would detain people, though, and the way we would detain them is with flex cuffs. But that would be something that you would do if you were like, say, the enemy has engaged you from a house. Everybody in that building, by the time you're going to clear the whole building, and they're either going to be shot in the engagement when you clearing the house, or they're going to be detained in such a way that they can't move until you can confirm that they are a non-combatant. And you may even want to
That's
gather
exactly
info from
the
them.
scenario I had in my head. I think that's kind of how I assumed it played out. So, just dealing with that kind of person control in a way that's different than just going in and shooting everybody, right? Like that's that. So you do have some type of
Yeah.
training in that regard.
Yes.
Yeah, and it was basically there was no in between when we're clearing a house in that manner. It's either you got shot because you were attempting to engage us, or you were about to engage us, or you were completely standing in the corner not doing anything. There wasn't a whole lot of in between. Occasionally, you might have a little hands-on actions with non-combatants if they get a little rowdy. But other than that, it was if we did have to detain people, we're searching for specific things in that area. So we want information of why there's enemy combatants in this area, or we want to find we think there's weapons in this area. So we're detaining everybody and we're questioning everybody with
You will be
interpreters or something like that.
compliant or you will be made compliant, and we will steer it up as necessary, is how it goes.
Yeah, it was there wasn't there's a lot less forgiving than I imagine a lot of police interactions are idealized as.
Yeah, certainly so, and especially in today's environment with policing.
Well, obviously, the only real parallel would be like I mean, there were times that we had to go in on a house emergency, like the street level officers, but really you're only talking about a SWAT type environment where you don't exactly know, what's going on. You come in there and, if I tell you to get down, you better get down or I'm going to put you down. That's the type of, you're not going to mosey in there as like a street officer. What's going on in here? You know what I mean? Talk to me. It's you're moving in with a purpose, and that's the only parallel I think would be the SWAT level stuff.
Non-lethal means
Yeah, there might be a little more parallel to the SWAT than anything, just because of the style and the have clear purpose for things. But kind of moving into some stuff that was going on recently related to those interactions, it looked like New York had some changes to the way they want to do arrests and including chokeholds and things like that. Paul, I think you brought that to my attention relatively recently. What's your take on that?
Well, to me, after watching the video and reading some of the feedback, that it's almost a little bit of a conflict of different types of procedures, and some of the things that they're talking about, such as do not put a knee in the back of someone who is resisting arrest as you're trying to handcuff them. Um,
at
Quite
all,
frankly,
period?
yes, period. That is now against the law in at least New York City, I believe, is where.
Like, at
Uh,
all, at all?
yes, it is completely against the law.
Okay, that's craziness.
So, in reality, that's how I was trained. It was like if you're fighting someone who's resisting you, you control them from the back, and you put pressure basically using your knee on their back as you are able to get your handcuffs on them. So I don't in that respect, I really don't understand that aspect of their law that they've passed. I don't think that's equivalent to putting someone in a chokehold. And outlawing the chokehold, at least from a department level, has been the case for quite some time. That's nothing new. The only thing new about that is now it's illegal. So you're actually seeing New York police officers being arrested for using these types of techniques. And one of my biggest criticisms is that if you watch their training video, they don't offer you any alternative to those types of techniques. So they say, don't do a chokehold, don't put your knee on their chest, don't put your knee on their back while you're handcuffing someone that's resisting. The only alternative they show is a scenario where you have two officers fighting one subject who in the training video is obviously probably another police officer who's being fully compliant, and he's laying on his stomach, and one police officer has a left arm and the other police officer has the right arm. So you have two police officers with this one person, and then they don't have his legs restrained at all. So in a real world fight, that's not really going to be that effective. You're just going to end up jerking on this guy's arms, which is probably going to end up causing some type of physical injury in all reality.
No, go
But
high, go low. That's how you take it.
they're not offering any alternative, at least in this training video that they put out. So they're saying, don't do this. It's against the law, and you will be arrested for doing this, but we're not going to tell you how you should do it. And when you are a police officer that's fighting somebody, and granted, I know, New York police are often working with a partner, so that's a little bit more helpful. But, in my case, oftentimes you're fighting someone completely alone. So I'm not sure how the experts would surmise you being able to effect an arrest with someone who is resisting when you're by yourself. So how would you fight someone who doesn't want to go to jail, but you're not allowed to use these particular techniques? It really doesn't make a lot of sense.
I found it rather interesting that they went through the it's not just, hey, this is the way you need to do things instead of this way. It was this stuff is an arrestable offense. You're just absolutely not allowed to do this stuff unless it's life or death, presumably. How do you go from there as a police officer? And I guess that's why you leave this open question here. How do you do it? And that's probably why you see these officers getting arrested. out there for doing choke holds and things like that, or even these actions that you're seeing here. And it makes sense how, in the grand scheme of things, if you've never done police work and you've never done anything like that, if you're looking out from the outside in and you've never had to restrain anybody, saying, hey, don't restrict their airway in any way. So don't mess with their neck, don't put any weight on their chest or their back where you could restrict their breathing in any way. And see how that's a knee jerk reaction to get to that point so quickly, instead of trying to find somewhere that makes sense, where things are, instilling temporary measures. So things like, if you're going to control their back with a knee, should be temporary because you don't want to restrict their airway. Or the same thing with the neck. That would be, seems like it's one that's a little more aggressive than the back even.
Well, I don't ever see the necessity of using the neck as a point of control unless it's
No,
a
that's
life.
completely unnecessary.
The only time it's necessary is if it's a life and death struggle at that point.
Correct.
Right. So, but up to that, I don't see how it's useful in most or necessary in most circumstances. But the knee to the back of someone that's in the prone position is kind of a standard training that you'll probably find in police agencies all over this country.
As a
And
temporary point of control to be able
Right.
to bind them.
Correct.
Yes.
And I think what we see with this is, at least my takeaway from this video, is that it has almost become illegal to arrest someone that is resisting arrest in the city of New York, because it is probably near impossible, especially in a one-on-one scenario. I would say it's impossible to effectively detain someone without using at least one of these techniques, which then makes it illegal to arrest someone who's resisting arrest at that point.
See, you have your knee on their back as part of the transition point when you are applying the handcuffs or the, as I was trained, zip ties.
Yeah, whether it's handcuffs or zip ties, there's a little bit of a different technique, but it wouldn't.
When you're applying them, you have your knee on their back or their shoulder.
Correct.
When you're applying the binding to your subject.
Yeah, so you can maintain control. That's the entire reason, is to maintain control of a resisting subject.
Yes, and then once you have the bindings on them, you don't have to have your knee on them anymore, and then you can let them go. You can remove your knee from their back.
That's an important distinguishment I would make, especially for people that might be listening that have no idea how this stuff really works, or the only way they've ever seen it is through some videos, Correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but, you would only do this to really effectively put cuffs on somebody. We're not saying, once you've got control of that person or that person is in custody, the cuffs are on, just sit there with your knee or two persons' knees on someone's back and maintain that pressure. I've never been trained that way.
No, you're absolutely correct. It would be use your knee in their back to affect an arrest, get handcuffs or zip ties on them, get them in the car, and get them out of there.
Right.
Do you guys think that because New York is doing this to where they're like, hey, don't use your knee, don't put weight on them, do you think you're going to see things like pepper spray and tasers be used a lot more to try to gain compliance from somebody so they can arrest them really fast?
That was a point I was going to make. I definitely think that, especially when you're talking about one officer, two officers, stuff like that. I mean, if you have somebody who's really not wanting to be arrested and you're in a fight, I think you're going to see an escalation of that level of, we're going to go to something else to gain compliance. And so to the public looking in, maybe they don't realize that it's all the same thing on the scale in use of force. So whether I punch you or use a taser or I OC, pepper spray for people who aren't in it, we can do any of those things. So I think And that's not going to look good on the camera, which is essentially what everything is about today.
Well, with this, we're going to go back to having more people getting killed with the tasers
Yeah. Well,
because
there's something to be said about that, but that's a topic we can get into another time.
Because the multiple shocks from the tasers, because some people are a few officers, one or two officers get ridiculous and don't pay attention to their training and overdo it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, departments, if you have tasers, you have to have a policy. And
Well,
essentially, the policies always say, you can't do more than X amount of,
Yeah.
5-second rides or whatever the case may be. It's 3 for us, so up to 15 seconds is the length of what I can tase somebody.
You do it to get your subject compliant.
Yeah.
But some people are just stupid about it and
But
they overdo
that's
it.
broken up as well, again, this is kind of going off on a different road, but
Sorry, my bad.
when I say 15 seconds, I mean, like, I'm going to do 5. That's the standard, ride. And then it's going to be, hey, put your hands behind your back, do what you're told, stop resisting. They're still fighting or they're trying to get up. You're getting another 5. Again with commands, and then another 5. After that, you need to move on to something else because you're outside of policy. That's kind of how it goes. I'm not going to say never, ever do that depending on the situation, but most places have a policy like that.
Now, do you think at the hospital, for instance, do you guys use these techniques that New York has largely gotten rid of to try to restrain somebody, where you're using your weight and knees and things like that?
Did you say at the hospital?
Yeah.
You're not going to see this too much. I mean, obviously, we've prone people out if we have to go hands-on. We follow a whole different set of shenanigans, especially when we go to the actual psychiatric unit. We don't have a choice because the Ohio Board of Mental Health requires me to put away all of my tools. So I go into that unit with other officers with no gun, no taser, no ASP, no pepper spray, no handcuffs. You're going hands on. That is your only recourse. So, I mean, it has happened, but we have a lot more staff that can also help. So, in that way, it's beneficial. I've seen 10 people trying to restrain somebody medically and things like that. We have other recourses in the hospital. We have a lot
You
more
have
hands on
chemical
deck.
constraints, so
We also have chemical restraints. They can order what we call like a B52. You're getting the whole lineup of medications to help you sleep, basically. So, but we don't do that. That comes from the medical side.
they're available on site, though.
But yeah, we have that.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense from the hospital side, where you wouldn't necessarily have to do that because a lot of your hands-on stuff may not be somebody who's in the right state of mind.
Yeah, precisely.
So that and you have a lot of restrictions based on that. How about this, where they've started to go into unarmed responses, leading from the medical ward? They're starting to go into unarmed responses in much more broader sense of the term, and that's San Francisco's doing it. And there's a number of other cities out there that have even more expansive than I've seen San Francisco's was, where it may be a non-criminal act or it may just be a non-violent act where a non-police officer will go out there. How do you guys feel about that? And as a broad thing.
Woosah. Oh my goodness.
I have a lot to say about that.
I do too.
I'm gonna let Paul take the lead on this one, but real quick on the last topic before we move on, I just want to say that I'm basically with Paul, especially as a police supervisor. This video, okay, you don't want me to use these techniques, fine. But my question as a supervisor for my guys is, then what do you want me to do? And that's what they're not telling you. This is how we've been trained, so what do you want me to do? So that's what's missing. That's the missing piece.
Yeah, and I'll give one last comment on that before we move on. It's ironic because they repeatedly show the video of one officer with one combatant that all these techniques are prohibited, but then the one part that they say do this, they have 2 officers for one combatant. So what are you supposed to do? And it's just you and one combatant. I'm not really sure because they don't ever tell you.
if you've removed the tool from my toolbox, give me a replacement.
Yeah, it looks easy on TV for the public, you know. Maybe Paul had something like this in the academy too, but they used to literally be like, okay, here's a guy, don't punch or kick me. I want you to put me in cuffs. And they would literally choose the two biggest students in the room, and they almost never could cuff this person. Didn't matter if it was a small girl. I've seen 125-pound women with 6 staff members at the hospital struggle to get somebody in restraints.
Yeah, I think that's where the general public really doesn't understand the level of a fight of someone of small stature, or any stature for that matter. If you want to resist at a high aggressive level, it's extremely difficult to get someone in handcuffs. And I don't think anything that the New York Police Department's provided in this training video is going to help those guys at all.
I'm all for the change, but again, tell me what to do. That that
Right.
we can only do what we're told.
Right. So moving on into the next the topic in regards to unarmed responders, personally, I think there is a very small, narrow amount of calls that would be beneficial in.
I read that article and I thought it was from The Onion. Oh my Lord.
Yeah, I mean, I've personally been to calls that there's absolutely no way a police officer should be responding. When you're getting a call from a mother who is angry at her daughter because she's watching TV and she doesn't want her daughter to watch TV, and you're calling the police to come deal with that, that's not something that police need to be responding to.
See,
but
you are very correct.
So for me, I see a very limited scope of scenarios in which there are calls that police absolutely should not be responding to. Unfortunately, a lot of these things that I've seen so far with some of these cities, like Gary mentioned, I'm not sure that's a great idea. You're talking about disorderly people who are intoxicated or drug overdoses, people who are threatening to commit suicide, which often involves weapons. It's almost scary to think, hey, we're going to just send out these people who don't have any way to protect themselves to deal with these people who can potentially get violent.
I believe that this is very similar to what we have. Well, in the Army culture, there is this thing that we have that is called the good idea fairy. And it's like, it sounds cool. It's really cool, neat. But it's really absolute garbage. Because it's really cool. It's a good idea. It's really cool. But as it comes by, as it manifests towards reality, it just gets worse and worse and worse. And by the time it actually manifests, it's this giant monstrosity that the people who actually do it have to deal with.
There's a big thing to be said on the two different releases that I've seen between San Francisco and I think it was St. Petersburg. The example there being that St. Petersburg was allowing non-police officers, and they call them community assistance liaisons, to respond to a much wider variety of incidents that could definitely potentially escalate very easily. Things like disorderly intoxication, or you may very easily get a violent interaction.
Well, what they should probably do for what they're doing, what they have, is instead of sending non-police officers, they should actually have a plainclothes department, like a plainclothes. They should have a plainclothes like public, like a police light department. So the public
Well,
has.
that's what they're kind of advertising.
Well,
They're
but
trying to they're trying to sell it.
they should still be full-fledged police officers who have a firearm, who have actual armor, who have full experience, who have actual proper training on how to deal with people, on full social interaction and full programs, and know how to deal with everything. So they can actually deal with the problem and can deal with de-escalating any situations and can diffuse the problem properly.
I think that I'm actually on board with some of the stuff that I read here, but the problem is that threat of violence. Until some of these things that I'm looking at, like let's say the disorderly intoxicated, I have a big problem with that. We just had an officer get killed in Toledo for that exact call. He literally went to the guy. It was like a well-being check, possible intoxicated. Home Depot parking lot. He comes up to the guy, sir, what's going on, that type of thing. The guy refuses. He's walking away. He turns, shoots him. Just like that. I think people should just be aware that somebody is going to get hurt or killed and not have the tools to effectively handle some of these situations unless they are at least first cleared by law enforcement in some capacity. Like, okay, it's safe for you to come in now. I'm going to let you take it from here. I kind of did the feeling it out. Now I'm going to let you take it over, social worker, whatever you are, because there is a place for some of this. They are literally asked to do too much every day. I mean, we basically fill all the holes, the stuff that people don't want to deal with on the street.
Yeah, cops are basically working 8 different jobs, it seems like a lot of the times, and you are essentially a social worker with a gun.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of joked about being called to a house about a little girl watching too much TV. I did that in the city.
Oh, I know I did. I actually, that's a true story. True
Right.
story.
I know. Yeah. But I did. So here's the thing for people listen. I didn't even have kids at the time. There was nobody else to help me. I go there to try to counsel someone as a parent on what they should do about their unruly kid. And I don't even have kids.
Same exact scenario for me.
You know what I'm saying? So
mine was a wife of a military service member who was deployed, so there was not a father in the household, and she was calling the police to be dad, and that's that's how I ended up there.
Yeah, and it's like, what do you say? And not so much like a dad. I literally sat with the kid more like a brother, and was just like, what's going on, man? Because I don't know what I'm doing. That type of thing, I think, is a place where somebody else that is more trained can step in. Because here's the thing, when a situation like that occurs, and let's say I get the proper department involved, like child protective services or something like that, let's say that's what
Fuck
we call
those
it.
people.
Well, right, but here's the thing. Once I leave that
No.
situation, now
somebody is bullshit.
I know, but listen. Once a cop is done dealing with that situation, I get them involved. The person who comes
I
and
don't
now
have
has to
anything
deal with that
positive to say
situation.
about that department. I've never had any positive interaction with them.
I understand that, but
Any-
here's the point I'm trying to make. Once the cop is out of that situation, the person that comes and then interjects and actually is qualified to handle that, they have 4 to 6 years of college experience dealing with that. I've had 6 months in a police academy. We're not qualified.
Anybody who works in social service, I have yet to meet anybody who's been in there for more than 3 years.
Yeah, I mean the same thing. I see it all the time at the hospital with mentally ill patients. You're not qualified to deal with that. Once they get into that clinical setting where I work, so okay, a cop arrests somebody, quote unquote arrests. It's a civil commitment to the hospital. Let's say like a pink slip, EMC. It has different names. You go out on a mental, you handle that situation. They take this person into custody. They're going to take them to the hospital. Sometimes they resist and stuff like that, and that's how mentals end up in jail. But they bring them to the hospital. Once you're done handling that, maybe you were dealing with this for 45 minutes as a cop on the street. Once you get that person to the hospital, even as a hospital cop, now somebody with a 6-year degree is the only one qualified to continue to deal with this, and a psychiatrist, a literal doctor. So you started the process on the street that you have absolutely no education for, maybe 6 months in an academy, and then bring that person to a clinical setting. So some of these situations, I think this would actually be very beneficial, but you got to get that element of danger. You got to do something about that.
Yeah, I I think that's where, again, there's no answers for those questions. They're saying, okay, we're going to do this, but and they are saying they say if an officer will always be dispatched to violent situations or life-threatening situations, but the problem with that is that, as you said, there is always that potential for violence, especially in some of these scenarios. You're going to a drug overdose or a disorderly drunk person or a suicidal person.
It may not be violent now.
Exactly, and that's a scary thing.
Have you ever given Narcan, Paul? To anybody?
I have not. No, that's ambulance be coming on that thing, man.
Do you know the first thing somebody does when you give them Narcan when they OD?
Oh God!
Generally, do you ever experience that?
No, I have not. What do they do?
They fight.
There you go.
That's what they do. Fight.
So you send an ambulance and a community liaison member to a drug overdose, and they become combative, and then you have to wait for the police to get there after the fact.
Yeah, I don't understand all the medical stuff behind it. I think just the extreme shift in depressant to I'm back, and it's just hiya.
All right,
they go crazy.
All right, Nick. Here's what you need to do. Next time you have to deal with Narcan.
I don't do that anymore at the hospital.
All right,
touch that stuff.
All right, as a medic, here's what I'll tell you. Next time you have to deal with that, do it slow. Don't hit them with a whole bunch. Don't hit them with all of it. Hit them with a little bit at a time. So just do it enough to just do it a bit, and then a bit, and then a bit. Because if you slam it, that's when it will get that complete reversal effect.
Gotcha.
Okay. And that's where you'll get that big effect like that.
Yeah, I'm looking here, and I was reading about that St. Petersburg city and how such a broad span of things. And we've talked already about the drug overdose and intoxication. And they have some good things on that list as well that make sense for somebody non police officer to do. But things as simple they have a very broad thing here where it says neighborhood dispute, and I think that's what is that even a class? Like, they have a specific classification for that? Because I could see that going very amicably and you really don't need much. But if they're calling the police, it could get pretty crazy out there. They halfway there, they could be fighting. Yeah, it seems like an interesting step to have such a broad list in that direction.
Yeah, again, I mentioned that one on my first comment on this topic, is that to me there is certainly a place for this type of role, community assistance liaison, or whatever you want to call yourselves. But the scope realistically has to be extraordinarily narrow. And when you look at this list, it's extremely broad and opens up the potential for putting someone in a violent situation that's not prepared for it. But like you said, there are certainly good ones on there. Disorderly juvenile at an elementary school. I don't need the police showing up for a 6-year-old. Like, that's just, that's crazy.
And what's surprising is a lot of people out there may not know, but there's plenty of schools these time and age that will call the police on elementary schools for kids that are acting crazy.
Well,
and that's
there's
outrageous.
Elementary schools that are having school resource officers. So you have 8-year-olds that need that need a police officer there on site. Now I get it. It's more of like a security issue, I guess you could say, to prevent violence perhaps at the school from someone outside coming in. So I can see if that's the concept for having a school resource officer, but I'm not really sure what else they would be doing dealing with 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. To me that would go in a very negative way against the perception of police. If you're using the police officer as the bad guy for the kid when he's acting up, then you're definitely creating a bad perception in that child's mind of what police officers actually are.
Absolutely. And I think that's all we got for tonight, guys. Thanks for listening. Check us out on Twitter at Oxygen Podcast, and look out for future social media editions on top of that. We'll be back next week for more into the police and military depths.